This video will provide a broad overview of sociological theory. Here is the outline for this lecture. Before we go into a more in-depth review of each theoretical perspective, it's important for us to establish what it means when we say theory in a sociological context. Theories are sets of statements or propositions. So this part of the definition of a theory is what signals to us that a theory is different than an opinion or an idea. Theory is supplemented and informed by observations that researchers make in the social world, right? Which is really broad, but theories are tending to focus on aspects of the social world. So if you recall the previous lecture where I discussed the micro level versus the macro level perspective, that is one of the ways that theorists are going to establish what their starting point is that helps them inform the theories that they create, which is a set of statements and propositions based on observations. Right? So these statements and propositions are designed in a way that attempt to explain various social phenomena, right? And sociological theories specifically are looking at social phenomena, events, patterns, and changes at either the micro or the macro level. All right, so we're going to begin with the conflict perspective. So you see in parentheses that I've written macro, and this is a way for you to understand what is the starting point of the conflict perspective or a conflict theorist, and it is macro level, right? So looking at large social structures across society, which can be groups of people, organizations, or institutions. So the conflict perspective, and your text identifies, is largely has been shaped and informed by the early writing and works of Karl Marx. And when Karl Marx was writing his slice of society, if you will, that he was most focused on and most interested in was the types of conflict that emerge between groups of people based on class, right? And his writing and his work highlighted this and focused on it. He talked about two groups of people, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. We can understand the bourgeoisie as the owners, right? The owners of the means of production, and the proletariat as the workers. So this is a very oversimplified explanation of Marx's theoretical contributions to the conflict perspective, yet is an illustrative example. Another defining characteristic of the conflict perspective that has since been extended to apply to other types of group or other forms of conflict at the macro level is that groups in this scenario, in this perspective, are characterized by being in competition with one another over resources. So this could include things like money, political power, weapons, jobs, rights, etc. Right? So there's lots of ways that social theorists, both within the discipline of sociology and beyond, have extended the early work and contributions of Karl Marx in utilizing the conflict perspective. Two more things that I want to emphasize and highlight that are defining features of the conflict perspective are two of its key propositions. So recall from the on the previous slide that part of the definition of theory is that it is a set of statements and propositions, right? So here are two of the defining and key propositions of the conflict perspective. And it is that power and domination are present in all group relationships, right? In social group relationships, right? So to define more specifically, power Sociologists understand power as the ability to achieve one's goal in spite of resistance. And domination is understood as being exhibited by the group with the greatest amount of power, right? That is then exerted systematically over other groups and individuals. Our next perspective is the structural functionalist perspective, which is also considered a macro level perspective. So where the conflict perspective is tending to focus on groups and the way that conflict and contention exists between groups, the structural functionalist perspective emphasizes the way that various social institutions work together by each serving an important and necessary function throughout society. So some of the major social institutions that sociologists focus on are work in the economy, government, education, religion, and family. So most of the theoretical perspectives within sociology are going to take up those institutions when utilizing the structural functionalist perspective. A key feature or key proposition to this perspective is that each institution's function, right? So think of it as like kind of what's the purpose of religion, or what's the purpose of government? What's the purpose of the economy? What's the purpose of education, right? So a theorist utilizing this perspective is going to look at the way each of these institutions, their function or their purpose, lines up with the overall norms and values and beliefs of that particular society, right? So this, of course, will vary both over time, but also when we look at different parts globally, right? Different regions, different countries. Another key proposition of this perspective is that each of these institutions within the broader social system, right, within society, persists and endures because there is a high level of agreement within the institution as to what its main function and purpose should be. The last key defining proposition of this perspective is that when there are significant disruptions to the system, right, or a particular society, that another part of the system, right, another institution, or maybe a combination of institutions, will absorb and adapt to the disruption. So an example of this would be that during an economic recession, like we are going through now, and that the US went through in 2008, 2009, that as unemployment increases, job opportunities and openings decrease, that one way that the system absorbs that is that people move back home, right? They move in with family, they move in with their parents, relatives, right? And that is the way that the system continues to function in spite of these very serious disruptions. Our third and final perspective that we will review is the symbolic interaction perspective, which, unlike the previous two, the conflict and structural functionalist, this one is starting at the micro level, right? Or the starting point is the micro level of analysis, right? Which is highlighting and emphasizing the face-to-face and small group interactions that we all have. In many ways, this perspective is the most relatable to students because we have had an infinite number and will continue to have these types of interactions in our lives. So the key propositions of the symbolic interactionist perspective is that shared meanings influence our interactions with one another. And it is because of these shared meanings that our day-to-day, face-to-face, small group types of interactions that we have are patterned, predictable, and normative. So an example of this would be, and this is very specific to American culture, and certainly in more regions, even within the US than others. And what I'm thinking about is this pattern of interacting where someone says to you, "Hi, how are you?" And you say, "Good," or "Fine." And then you say, "How are you?" back. But no one really stops, and typically speaking, no one really stops and gives a full-blown explanation of how they're doing, right? And if you've actually had that type of interaction where you thought you were just saying a quick greeting in the form of, "Hi, how are you?" And then someone starts to actually tell you how they're doing, especially if it's not good, right? And it's they're going through something difficult or challenging, or, just something kind of not uplifting and easy type of quick interaction to have. You likely felt unprepared, right? That wasn't what you were expecting, and you weren't actually intending to have this full-length conversation with them, right? And so that's a really good example of the way that different cultures and different societies will have these interactions and different types of norms to the way they interact, right? Because of this shared meaning that we are all a part of, right? We are all a part of shared meanings in our society that are part of our culture, our communities, our neighborhoods, and our families, right? So the next proposition is that signs and symbols are both socially created and socially reproduced. So signs and symbols include a lot of things. Language, right? So not just the language that you speak, right? And the ability that gives you to communicate and interact with others, right? But also the certain expressions, right? So this can really come up with people from different generations or different cultural and regional backgrounds, where it can be difficult to communicate clearly because you use expressions differently, right? A really good example of this is that my mom and her generation, the baby boomers, they would often use this expression meaning that they were going to meet up with one another to do something, right? Like to go to the movies or go bowling or whatever it was. And they'll say, "I'll hook up with you later." So if you are not a part of that generation, that means something very different today than it does to the generation of baby boomers, right? When you say, "We'll hook up later," it doesn't mean we're just going to hang out as friends platonically and like go get a meal or go get shave ice or go to the beach, right? It means something very differently. So this is the way that signs and symbols within language, this is an example of how it changes over time, right? But more often than not, that process is pretty slow, right? So the different other kinds of signs and symbols that symbolic interactionists pay attention to are objects, cultural markers, colors and ideas, right? There's all kinds of signs and symbols that we interact with on a daily basis, and we typically don't give too much thought to why it is that this color is associated with this feeling, right? Or why this shape is assigned to this particular instruction, right? Like whether it's a street sign or art, something like that, right? So those are the key propositions of the symbolic interactionist perspective. And they are really focusing on the face-to-face and small group interactions and the ways that individuals also interact with these different signs and symbols, right? So it can be something literal like a stop sign, right? Or the traffic lights, right? And the meanings that are attached to it, and those are enforced by law, right? But it doesn't always have to be that formal. And so this is the broad overview of the three sociological perspectives: the conflict, the structural functionalist, and the symbolic interactionist.